I'm Assistant Professor of Women and Gender Studies here at AUB in the Department of English. I just started in August, and so it's really nice to begin only my second semester here with a... Great, thank you. To begin only my second semester here with such an exciting conference about feminism. So what we're going to do in this panel is I'm going to introduce the speakers one by one. We're going to have all the papers in a row, and then we'll have questions at the end. Just a reminder that Jennifer is happy to have this panel filmed, but the other speakers would like no photographs or filming during their papers, so if everyone could just make sure to do that, and if we could make sure not to live tweet this session either, that would be great. Feel free to tweet the titles, but don't tweet the contents of any of the papers, just so we can keep our discussion today in this room. Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague Jennifer Nish. Jennifer Nish is Assistant Professor of Rhetoric and Composition in the English department here at the American University of Beirut. Her research focuses on transnational feminism, activism, and digital rhetoric. Her work has been published or is forthcoming in Peitho, Journal of the Coalition of Feminist Scholars in the History of Rhetoric and Composition, Genre and the Performance of Publics. I wasn't expecting that title to be so long when I started. And Feminist and Queer Theories, a Transnational Reader. She's currently working on a book manuscript, which I'm very much looking forward to, about feminist activist rhetoric, titled Activist Assemblages, Transnational Feminisms, Rhetorical Genres, and Social Media. So, Jennifer, I'm going to sit in the front row so I can see the PowerPoint.
Okay. Thank you for the introduction. Hi, everyone. So as the title indicates, actually, I don't know if you read the title. So my title is, no, it's fine. I'm just correcting myself as I talk. So the title of my talk today is Rhetorical Genres and the Limits of Feminist Activism. Can a selfie be a feminist act? And so what I'm trying to do in the presentation is think through kind of theoretically what are some of the boundaries that we draw around feminism and activism, and what are some of the ways that we talk about digital communication in relation to feminism and activism, using the selfie as an example. And one of the reasons that I think this conversation about selfies is important is because of the way that selfies are often represented in popular discourse, which, as you might expect, often involves mocking those who create and take selfies as vain, superficial, narcissistic, etc. For example, blogger Erin Ryan argues that selfies aren't empowering. They're a high-tech reflection of the effed up way society teaches women that their most important quality is their physical attractiveness. In an article for The Telegraph, writer Harry Wallop suggests that perhaps we should be worried not about teenage girls, but about grown men, including world leaders, who love nothing more than a selfie. And as with many gendered insults, this one achieves its punch by devaluing the selfie as a practice associated with women and, even worse, young women. So a team of psychologists has even responded to concerns about selfies by constructing a study to determine whether, and I'm not sure how this is pronounced, selfitis or selfieitis, I think selfieitis, is something that can be considered a diagnosable mental illness. So the language about selfies, like a lot of discourse about new uses of technology, often verges on moral panic. And cultural critic Henry Giroux has argued that selfie culture, quote, speaks to the disintegration of those public spheres, modes of solidarity, and sense of inclusive community that sustain a democratic society. So he sees selfie culture as taking up public space that was once focused on dialogue and important social problems for narcissistic and superficial purposes, and also he's concerned about the ways that people are making them available for surveillance through their use of selfies. However, I take issue with Giroux's nostalgia for previous forms of public discourse. I think it's problematic. A number of influential scholars have critiqued the notion of the public sphere as a formation in which everyone isn't equally able to participate or be heard. And so the notion of counter-public discourse emerged as a way of highlighting techniques through which marginalized speakers and writers add perspectives that were outside of the mainstream or dominant discourse. And I think the internet and digital technology, including mobile phones and social media, have altered some of the barriers for participation in public discourse. So selfie culture is possible because the barriers for participation have changed, and this means that public discourse now includes a wide range of things that weren't previously circulated or engaged with on such a wide scale. So I'm looking at the selfie in conversation with rhetorical genre theory, and for those of you who aren't familiar with rhetorical genre theory, it looks at how communication practices develop into recognizable types and what those communication genres do for the people who use them. So rhetorical genre theorists emphasize that communicative genres aren't merely texts that share formal features, but they are texts that have developed similar patterns through through the repetition of similar rhetorical situations over time. So some other examples of things that are considered rhetorical genres would be like letters, newspaper articles, conference presentations, and these very broad genres can also be broken down into smaller, more specific genres like the business letter or the poster presentation, the restaurant review. So genres develop when communicators with similar purposes, audiences, or contexts develop similar kinds of texts in response to those situations. And the selfie, I think, is a rhetorical genre that can also be broken down into a wide range of purposes and audiences and contexts. So some of those purposes might be focused on appearance, but other purposes are definitely political in nature. Before getting to those, I want to situate the selfie briefly within the history of self-portraiture, because I think this is an important move to make in kind of legitimizing the selfie as a genre. So self-portraiture has a rich history in fine art. So this is Van Gogh and Frida Kahlo. Even within early photography practices, this is a daguerreotype of Robert Cornelius taken in 1839, I think. Through these examples, we can see that like selfies are not necessarily quite so feminized, nor is this such a recent practice. I have kind of a wide range of old-time kind of examples of ways that people took self-portraits. And another example that, unlike the previous ones, is more vernacular, like the selfie, is the old photo booth machines. Photomatic, maybe, is what they were called. And so these show that the selfie is not actually something that started with mobile phones and digital technology, but it has a rich history that we should draw on. Cindy Sherman is an example of an artist who has sort of built her fame through photographic self-portraiture. As an interesting side note, she is now creating and sharing work on Instagram, but she has carefully distinguished that from her real work. And she apparently doesn't like being associated with selfies, so like multiple people have connected selfies with her work, but in interviews about this, she mocks selfies a little bit. But I don't think this is surprising given the way that people think and talk about selfies, and I'll discuss that a little bit more in a moment. So Jill Walker-Retberg has noticed that the difference between most of the forms of self-portraiture that we're probably culturally familiar with and selfies is the fact that selfies are vernacular. I think this is also one of the things that makes them important and why we shouldn't be dismissing the genre as frivolous. So as many people in this audience probably know, there's a history of marginalizing and devaluing forms of creative expression by marginalized people. So women's creative practices being labeled as craft rather than art are one example. The history of devaluating and appropriating African American forms of creative expression is another good example. So with that in mind, I want to then kind of get to the selfie in specific. And when someone talks about the selfie, I think the classic example or the image that many of us have in mind is somebody with a cell phone kind of doing this, maybe making duck face or something. And that is what a lot of selfies look like. But there's actually quite a bit of variation when you search for like the hashtag selfie or look at things that people have labeled selfies. There's a wide range of practices involved. And one of the things that rhetorical genre theorists do, like descriptive linguists, they focus on the ways that people define the genre and use the genre rather than having a top-down classification. So when I'm thinking about what a selfie is and how a selfie is used, I'm thinking about it from the perspective of what people label selfies. So the typical selfie is something that is very much devalued, and it is also very gendered. So a well-known study by Lev Manovich examined selfies in a range of cities, New York, Sao Paulo, Moscow, Berlin, and Bangkok. And significantly more of the selfies in their random sample were taken by women and men, which does lend weight to the idea that discourse about selfies is a feminist issue. Anne Burns has critiqued discourse about selfies, which she sees as enacting a subtle yet significant form of social control and a means for maintaining engendered power relations by devaluing selfies and identifying them as feminine. Popular discourse serves to direct disdain at young women openly and largely without challenge. So it's a socially acceptable way of not liking women or what women do. With this kind of in mind about selfies as a gendered practice, but one which is maybe oversimplified, I want to turn a little bit to thinking about how selfies might be social or political. Okay, so, and here, just as an example, I did a quick search yesterday for selfie hashtag on Instagram, and as you can see, this really contrasts quite a bit with the Google image search for selfie, which I think was a bit more of our stereotypical idea of what a selfie is. So you can see like a family, two people together with a giant fish, but I mean, this is not quite the stereotypical image. So in contrast to this stereotyped discourse, I see a lot of social and political uses of the selfie happening. And I think the contrast between popular representations of the selfie as a sign of narcissism and these socially motivated self-representations speaks to the difficulty we're having reconciling some categories that used to seem clearer and simpler. Individual and social, private and public, these used to seem more straightforward, but digital communication has complicated our understanding of these categories. And this is increasingly important as conversations about activism, feminism, and power struggle to respond to neoliberalism and discourses about individual freedom, personal responsibility, and things that have been used to prop up oppressive ideologies and practices. So one way is that we can understand, I think, selfies as a social or political act is through processes of identification and disidentification. So identification has been used in rhetorical theory and psychoanalytic theory to think about the ways that people develop their sense of self through relating their self to another like single person or groups of people. And cultural theorist Jose Munoz published a really excellent book on the process of disidentification, which he positions as a strategic form of cultural and textual production that involves subjects negotiating with dominant cultural messages in order to resist the oppressive logics that undergird power systems that exclude or oppress them. So he positions disidentification as a survival strategy that works within and outside the dominant public sphere simultaneously and allows people to construct identities in difference. And he also talks about this as contributing to the function of a counter-public sphere. So with this in mind, I want to talk about some examples of how I think selfies can be used in ways that fit Munoz's idea of disidentification. And just to note, he is talking specifically about queers of color. What I have tried to do is think about, kind of intersecting identities in my search for selfies that can be used for disidentification, but I haven't fully expanded on kind of the differences between the populations I'm looking at and his. So there are a variety of hashtags that have emerged on social media that are used to link selfies together and develop communities that are built around rejecting specific cultural logics. A really prominent example of this are body positive and fat acceptance activists who use selfies to increase the visibility of body sizes and types that aren't represented or are usually represented negatively in dominant cultural forms. Social media, so here are some examples. And this is Virgie Tovar. She's a really prominent body positive and fat acceptance activist. Some other examples are hashtags that focus on racial identity. This one has like natural hair. There's also like the hashtag Black is beautiful, melanin, Black girl magic. I don't have examples from all of these. There are a lot of people using Instagram to highlight kind of a range of forms of gender expression and identity or even sexual orientation. So bringing visibility to these kinds of practices, but also connecting to other people in ways that are facilitated by digital communications ability to help people with similar interests or identities kind of find each other across different social situations and geographic constraints. So here are some other examples of selfies that I've found using hashtags non-binary, the hashtag non-binary. And these selfies I found using the hashtag trans, and these are all publicly available posts. Then finally, I want to think too about, so this is another kind of emergent form of selfies that some journalists reported on. These are Tunisians taking photos of garbage, which I'm sure Beirutis here can relate to call attention to structural problems with their government. And so this is kind of another like less gendered but very overtly political way of using the selfie in kind of a specific context for activist purposes. People also take selfies at protests. These are Freddie Gray protesters and anti-austerity protesters. They also take selfies for non-progressive reasons. These are pro-life protesters at an abortion clinic. So, I mean, that caveat kind of brings me to the end of my little exploration here, kind of thinking through what is and isn't possible with a selfie, and there are caveats to, I guess, what I'm saying here, which is that we're not ever going to be able to place selfie as like a progressive genre or a narcissistic genre. I mean, much of it depends on the orientation of the people who are using it and their social situation. And so just like discussions of how digital media or social media can be used in activism. No selfie alone, no like tweet alone is going to be activism. We always need to see them either as part of like a conversation or as one point in like a larger process. And another example of selfies being kind of like one moment in a broader activist project is these examples from the uprising of women in the Arab world. So this campaign was part of like a broader set of activities or actions that this group created. And the selfies, I think, have a lot of potential for drawing visibility to an issue and drawing the attention of people who might otherwise ignore the political articles or things that one posts on social media. So yeah, I'm out of time, so I'm gonna end there, but there's lots more to say, so I'm happy to talk more about anything I didn't get to or any questions you have in the discussion. Thanks.